In 1985, deep inside Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire, someone noticed something that didn't belong there. Not a fallen tree, not old camping gear. Two large industrial steel barrels sitting where no one would ever expect to find them. Rangers called law enforcement. Investigators hiked in, marked the locations, and opened the containers. What they found inside confirmed one thing immediately. These barrels had not been left there by accident. They contained the remains of multiple people. No identification, no wallets, no documents, no personal items that could clearly say, "This is who I was." Just human lives reduced to evidence. In the 1980s, that created a specific kind of problem. Police had tools to investigate homicides. They had systems to track missing persons, but those systems depended on one starting point: a name. When investigators don't know who a victim is, the case starts at a disadvantage. There are no relatives to interview, no last known address, no workplace, no school, no phone records. Just questions. Who were they? Where did they come from? And why had no one reported them missing? The site was searched extensively. The barrels were removed, carefully documented, and preserved. Crime scene photographs were taken. Every standard procedure of the time was followed. Autopsies suggested that the victims were a woman and several young children. Artists created facial reconstructions. Composite images were released to the public. Flyers went out. News reports ran year after year. The same result came back. No one recognized them. As time passed, families walked the trails of Bear Brook State Park without knowing they were passing one of the state's deepest mysteries. Then, in the year 2000, something happened that made the case even more unsettling. Less than a football field away from the original discovery site, another barrel was found. Same type of container. Same method of concealment, same pattern. Inside were remains connected to the original case. This was no isolated incident. Someone had come back to almost the exact same spot at a different time and done the same thing again. By 2000, forensic science had improved. DNA testing was now a standard investigative tool. Samples were taken. Profiles were built. The remains were entered into national databases. Investigators hoped for a breakthrough. What they got was silence. No matches. No hits in CODIS. No corresponding missing persons reports. DNA could say that some of the victims were related to each other. It could confirm a family connection between a woman and some of the children. And if the victims had never been entered into a system as missing persons, there was nothing for the DNA to match against. But it could not say who they were. The case went cold. But cold doesn't mean forgotten. Detectives rotated in and out. Files were reviewed. Tips were logged when they came in. As new forensic techniques appeared, the Bear Brook evidence was revisited in the 1990s and early 2000s. Analysts tried isotope testing to estimate where the victims might have lived based on chemical signatures in their bones and teeth. The results suggested movement across different parts of the United States. helpful, but not enough. The case remained stuck at the same critical point. Without names, everything else was guesswork. And this is what most people misunderstand about cold cases. They don't stall because investigators stop caring. They stall because the science of the time can't yet answer the questions the evidence is asking. For more than 3 decades, the barrels from Bear Brook State Park sat in storage. DNA profiles sat in databases. Notes and theories filled binders. Everything needed to solve the case already existed. What didn't exist yet was the right kind of science. In the early 2000s, nearly 3,000 miles away in California, another case would begin. On the surface, it had nothing to do with a state park in New Hampshire. But the man at the center of that investigation would eventually become the key to unlocking Bear Brook. In Part 2, we follow that man, a drifter with many names, and see how a single DNA test tied him to a child from one of those barrels in the woods. The Barrels in the Woods, Part 2. The man with many names in the early 2000s. On the other side of the country, detectives in California were working what looked like a straightforward case. A woman named Unsolved had stopped answering calls. Friends grew worried. When officers checked her home, they discovered she had been killed and concealed on the property. Suspicion quickly focused on the man she lived with. He called himself Bob Evans. Evans worked with his hands. He did odd jobs. Neighbors knew him as quiet, sometimes distant, but not especially remarkable. He blended in when police brought him in. They ran his fingerprints as part of routine processing. That's when the first cracks appeared. The prints didn't line up cleanly with the identity Bob Evans. Records were inconsistent. Background details didn't make sense. Dates and places didn't add up. Investigators realized that the man in custody had been using more than one name. In fact, over the years, he had used several. He was what investigators sometimes call a chameleon, someone who moves frequently, shifts identities, and leaves very little consistent information behind. For the California case, his real name wasn't immediately essential. They could still prosecute based on the evidence of what had happened to Yoon Soon Jun, but in the background, questions were piling up. Who was this man really? Where had he come from? And was California the first place something had gone wrong? As part of standard procedure, a DNA profile was created from the man known as Bob Evans. That profile sat in databases like many others. One of millions of entries. At first, it looked unremarkable. But in New Hampshire, analysts running DNA from the Bear Brook case noticed something unexpected. One of the child victims from the barrels showed a biological connection to the man calling himself Bob Evans. He wasn't just some distant match, he was the child's father. That link instantly shifted the Bear Brook investigation. For the first time, detectives could connect the anonymous remains in the park to a living individual with a known location and history. But even then, there were problems. The New Hampshire victims still had no names. The man tied to the child still had no confirmed legal identity, and the timeline of how he moved from state to state remained unclear. Investigators now believed that the same man who had lived under the name Bob Evans in California had spent part of his earlier life in New Hampshire. That meant he might have known or even lived with the victims in Bear Brook State Park. But knowing that connection and proving it are two different things. Over the next years, more research was done on Bob Evans. Old photographs surfaced. Employment records were tracked. Police reports from different states were compared. Slowly, a pattern formed. Different names, different jobs, different partners. Children whose paperwork didn't always match. This was not someone who left a clear trail. Even after he died in prison, questions followed him. Who were all the children he had been seen with? How many identities had he used? And how many jurisdictions had pieces of his story without realizing they were connected? The Bear Brook case now had a likely perpetrator, but the most important questions remained unanswered. Who were the woman and children in those barrels? Where had they lived before New Hampshire? And how could investigators finally give their families certainty? The answer wouldn't come from a traditional police lineup, or a lucky witness, or another confession. It would come from a new kind of science, one that didn't just look for an exact DNA match in a criminal database, but searched for distant relatives among ordinary people who had mailed away a kit to learn more about their ancestors. By the late 2010s, the Bear Brook case had something it had never truly had before: time-tested evidence, preserved DNA, and a suspect whose genetic profile was already on file. What it still didn't have were names for the victims. Traditional DNA searches had hit their limit. The profiles from the victims and from the man known as Bob Evans had already been checked against criminal databases, but no direct matches. No missing persons records perfectly lined up. To move forward, investigators needed a different question. Instead of asking, "Whose DNA is this?" they needed to ask, "Who might this person be related to?" That question belongs to a field called genetic genealogy. For decades, everyday people had been sending their DNA to commercial companies to learn more about their ancestry, where their families came from, whether they had distant cousins in other countries, how their heritage was distributed across the globe. Some of those people chose to upload parts of their genetic information to public matching services. These platforms allowed users to find potential relatives who had done the same. Forensic experts realized that if crime scene DNA could be compared against these public uploads, investigators might be able to find distant relatives of an unidentified person, even if that person had never been in a criminal database. In the Bear Brook case, investigators partnered with a genetic genealogist named Barbara Raventer and others experienced in this new method. A preserved DNA profile from one of the Bear Brook victims was carefully prepared and uploaded into a public genetic database under strict protocols. The system did not return a full name. Instead, it returned fragments. third cousins, distant matches, clusters of people who shared small segments of DNA with the victim. On their own, those matches looked like noise. But to a genealogist, they were the edges of a map. Working backward, experts built family trees for these distant matches using public records, census data, birth and death certificates, marriage licenses, obituary notices, archived newspapers, and other historical documents, branch by branch. They looked for where these separate lines might converge, a common ancestor that would tie multiple DNA matches together. After months of work, a pattern emerged. Multiple distant matches pointed back to the same extended family line from the New England and California regions. From that shared ancestor, the team then worked forward, generation by generation, to identify all the descendants who could potentially fit the unknown victim's profile. Which relatives had daughters or grandchildren who disappeared from records, who moved frequently, whose paperwork showed sudden breaks, no forwarding address, no further school records, no clear explanation. Through this process, one woman's name rose to the surface: Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch. Marlise had last been seen in the late 1970s in California after a family disagreement around Thanksgiving. She left with her two young daughters, Marie and Sarah. Relatives searched for them over the years. They heard rumors, followed leads, and wondered if the silence meant a fresh start somewhere else. But no official missing persons reports ever connected them to New Hampshire. Now, the DNA and the family trees suggested something different. Testing confirmed that the adult woman and two of the children from the Bear Brook barrels were Marlise and her daughters. A fourth child in the barrels, however, was not related to Marlise. Genetic analysis showed that she was biologically connected to the man known as Bob Evans, but had a different mother. This middle child had long puzzled investigators. For years, her presence in the barrel didn't fit any obvious family structure. Genetic genealogy finally explained why she was part of the same pattern of movement and deception, but from a separate chapter in his life. With these identifications, the Bear Brook victims were no longer labels in a file. They were Marlise, Marie, Sarah, and an as yet publicly unnamed child whose connection to the suspect is now understood in far greater detail. The man behind the alias Bob Evans was ultimately identified as Terry Rasmussen, a longtime offender whose path crossed multiple states and multiple investigations. The barrels in Bear Brook State Park did not change. The evidence inside them did not change. What changed was our ability to listen to what that evidence was saying. The case is now studied across the United States as an example of how preserving evidence, even when technology isn't ready yet, can pay off decades later. Because somewhere in an evidence room right now, there are still envelopes and boxes labeled unidentified. There are families who don't know where their relatives went. There are pieces of DNA that don't yet have the right tools to interpret them. History hasn't forgotten them. It's just not finished reading them. Evidence never expires. Science just has to catch up.